Mesdames et messieurs, nous allons commencer. So let's begin. Welcome everyone. Bienvenue à tous. My name is Patricia Albanese. I'm the president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And thank you for taking the time this morning. I know there are a lot of programming options available to you here at Congress, and they're all valuable investments of our time, but this one's an especially important workshop, a very timely, relevant workshop, so I'm really glad that you're here with us today. As you all know, land acknowledgements are becoming more common, both on and off campuses, for good reason. But not surprisingly, some have come to question the practice's sincerity and impact. It's something that, if it's recited mechanically by a speaker who seems to be eager to just check off boxes on their list, their to-do list, then the practice becomes meaningless, and the true meaning of why we do this is lost. So I'm certainly not an expert on land acknowledgements, but I personally believe that when we're guests on someone's territory, as we are on the Musqueam territory, we have to approach our conduct with reflexivity. And here we're on this beautiful campus where the Pacific Ocean meets the Rocky Mountains, where the trees contrast with the sky. This is Musqueam ancestral territories of their stories, traditions, and teachings. Everything that surrounds us has been here long before us. Everything is much, much bigger than us. It is our responsibility and role to approach our time here with deep and sincere humility. As a researcher and educator myself, I'm very seriously committed to listening and learning and growing and sharing and remaining open and humble throughout the process. And I hope that this workshop will help me personally and help all of us together reflect on how we can approach land acknowledgements with sincerity, humility, and with a commitment to building relationships and to engaging meaningfully with local Indigenous cultures. Thankfully, our panel today is made up of experts who can share their expertise with us today. So today we have Dr. Sheila Cote-Meek, who is Associate Vice President, Academic and Indigenous Programs at Laurentian University. She's also, as of last year, a valued member of the Federation's Indigenous Advisory Circle. We also have Daniel Heath Justice, Acting Director of the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies here at the University of British Columbia. And last but not least, Dr. Vanessa Watts, who graciously accepted to moderate this morning's workshop. She's Director of Indigenous Studies and Assistant Professor of Sociology at McMaster University. So before Dr. Vanessa Watts, as moderator, kicks things off today, I'd like to invite Dr. Daniel Heath Justice to say a few words, perhaps a land acknowledgement of his own, before we get started.
Before I start, I wanted to begin. I'm a language learner. I'm the first member of my family to learn Cherokee in 2 generations. And I'd like to start my acknowledgement in Cherokee. And before I do so, if there are any Cherokee language speakers in the room, apologies for my baby pronunciation. Sio negad, je jalagihi ayetl eoni, jalagi godi, denili doyokte dagwadon, Daniel Justice dagwadon, yonega gondi, galihaliga mathguam ayetl jigado wado. My name is Daniel Justice. Through my father, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. I've been here in Musqueam Territory since 2012. As part of the acknowledgements, in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and throughout UBC, we often begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. We honor that relationship of the Musqueam people to these territories, as well as the work that they are doing now and have done for generations to protect these lands and waters and to maintain that relationship into the future. And we always hope that we are good visitors on their lands. We're careful about not saying that we're guests, because guesthood is a different thing than being a visitor, and I think that's something hopefully we'll talk a little bit about. But in acknowledging where we are, we also want to acknowledge the particular educational relationship that the Musqueam people have in these lands. UBC has been here for just over 100 years. The Musqueam have been here since the last ice age. And this has been a site of learning and knowledge and transmission of tradition for all that time. So when we're acknowledging territory and the relationships, we're also acknowledging that we are in an ongoing relationship of learning, and also understanding how learning and education have been weaponized against Indigenous people. And in spite of that, the Musqueam people have worked very hard to build and expand and heal educational relationships here. Through the 2006 Memorandum of Affiliation between Musqueam and UBC, and myriad partnerships between the university and the community, and with other Indigenous communities, not just in the region, but throughout the country that is currently called Canada, and throughout the world. So in our acknowledgements, we're not only talking about acknowledging the fact that we are on territory with a history, but we're also on territory with deep and significant relationships, and many of those relationships are about learning. Musqueam has been very strong as a community in ensuring that the work that we do at the university is respectful, responsible, and affirms Indigenous people's humanity. And we hope that we continue to build on that tradition and do so with honor and integrity. So I just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you to my fellow panelists for the opportunity to talk more about the complexities and the importance of territorial acknowledgements. Wado.
Hey, good morning. Chimigwech Daniel for establishing a really good critical context for our conversation today. Sego Bojo, Vanessa Watts, Indigenous Cause, Six Nations, Minoa Curve Lake, and Donjaba, Makwa Dodem. So yes, welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming today. Just to give you an idea of how the flow of the workshop is going to proceed, we have the privilege of having Daniel and Sheila here with us today, and I'm going to be asking them a couple of questions to help us think through these complexities that Daniel referred to, challenges, opportunities when thinking through how to develop and invest in a meaningful land acknowledgement, whether it's within your institution, in your department, etc. And Indigenous folks have been acknowledging each other's territory for a really long time, a lot longer before the TRC arrived. But the TRC presented a critical moment for institutions where there was an important pivot. That is, institutions started to work towards land acknowledgements as a form of responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And since that time, these past few years, there's been a number of land acknowledgements produced. But as Patrizia noted, we're in this time now where how do we ensure that land acknowledgements extend beyond symbolic gestures and have some teeth and some meaning, that they will continue beyond this reconciliation discourse that we're in, that they will be everlasting, and that we're working with First Nations communities, Métis communities, Inuit communities, wherever we are and wherever we live. So with that, we're going to have this time for a conversation, and then we're going to have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then we're going to break out into groups and do a little bit of workshopping, and then we'll be wrapping things up. So with that, we will get started with our first question. So land acknowledgements began as an Indigenous protocol and practice, long in existence before the TRC's calls to action were released. So in both of your experiences, what sorts of benefits have land acknowledgements seen in terms of the institutions? And also, what sorts of disadvantages come along with that, with the crafting of land acknowledgements?
Bojo, Kwekwe, Semakwe, Dijnakas, Makwa Dodem, Temiagama, Anishinaabe, So my name is Sheila, Cote-Meek, and I come from the Temiagama Anishinaabe. It's a small community in northeastern Ontario, and I come from the Bear Clan. And I'm just really happy to be here and arrive here this morning. I think I wanted to start with just saying and picking up on the piece that Vanessa just spoke about, that land acknowledgements and acknowledgement of Indigenous nations have been around for a long time, way before TRC. And when I was reflecting on it, I was thinking about my own experience, personal experience with that. So, as long as I can remember, since I was a young child, whenever we went to visit people that we didn't know, or we were in a different kind of territory, the first questions that come out of Indigenous people's mouths are, who are you, and where do you come from, and who are your people? And it's actually quite natural. It's not offensive as it might sound when you ask those kind of questions, but in terms of kin and community and so forth, those kinds of questions are really kind of critical in contexting ourselves and our families as we go in to meet other people. So when I talk about acknowledgements, then land acknowledgements are just a part of that, acknowledging who you are, that you've come to a place that is different than your own home community and so forth, and contexting yourself either through your genealogy or your kinship was natural. So then, fast forward to my time in post-secondary, I work at Laurentian now, but prior to that, I worked at Cambrian College in the late 80s, and one of the first things that I was tasked to do was to develop a kind of a strategic plan for the Indigenous unit there. And it was interesting because at that particular time, land acknowledgements in institutions weren't really talked about. But one of the things that became quite evident very quickly from the Indigenous people that I spoke with in terms of developing the plan was they wanted some kind of symbolic gesture placed on the campus that showed the presence of Indigenous people of that particular nation on campus. So one of the things that we did early on was we raised a flag, and it was the Anishinaabeg flag, and that was kind of one of those symbolic gestures that said, this is the land of the Anishinaabeg people, and we're recognizing them as a part of it. And now later on, post-TRC, we see a lot more verbal gestures happening in institutions. And I think there's both positive and negative to it. I would say that there's probably, in my own personal opinion, more positive than kind of the negative pieces that we're hearing now. So for instance, I think when community members come on campus and they actually hear their communities being acknowledged, it's really important to them. Like, we've had elders come up to us and tell us, thank you. Miigwech, thank you so much for acknowledging that we exist here in this land and in this community, because where Laurentian is located, the First Nation community is just like a 15-minute drive outside of the city. And for the longest time, the community was never really acknowledged. And so when they come in and they hear that, it's really important to them. So we still do it. We still make sure that we're acknowledging people verbally in like public addresses and so forth. But we've been working to do other things that make it known that we're on Indigenous land as well. I'll leave it at that for a minute and then get to kind of some of the difficulties and challenges, and then I'll pass it on to Daniel.
One thing for me is always reaffirming the fact that acknowledgements are just one part of a relationship. Right. And I think that's missing from the kind of formulaic land acknowledgements, where people they do it because they think they have to, and then we go on with the rest of the business, rather than acknowledgements being actually part of the relationship that we are engaging in. And that relationship, I think, is exactly this issue about the recognition. It's not easy. And I think people want the acknowledgement. I think people mean well with the acknowledgement. But there is often a sense that I have that the acknowledgement takes the place of sustained and difficult relationships. Like the reason we have to do acknowledgements, that we have so much struggle around that, is because we're in occupied territory. And the realities of colonialism have been superimposed over the realities of Indigenous peoples' relationships to these lands. And it doesn't mean that those relationships have been lost, but it means that when people walk around UBC, what they're often seeing is settler experience. They're not actually seeing those generations of Musqueam relationships to the land. So I think there's a lot that's positive from it, but I think that the key point for me is that acknowledgements are never the sum total of what we're meant to do. When we have an acknowledgement, that is always a beginning point. And sometimes that beginning point is in a complicated place. And if acknowledgements didn't matter, people wouldn't be so anxious about them. I remember the first, so oftentimes at commencement, our presidents say traditional, ancestral, and unceded. But I was here for about 4 years before the unceded was included. So at commencement, they would say traditional and ancestral, but not unceded. And I remember the first time I heard unceded, it was kind of a jolt, because people had been pushing for that, and finally it was present. And then my memory may be hazy, but I think I'm right. Stephen Toop's last commencement, I think he added occupied as well. And these things matter. And that's why I think we have to talk about them. But I think we can't have acknowledgements feel comfortable, because those acknowledgements are engaging with really complicated realities around the lands that we are in, and the histories of those lands, and the ongoing challenges of being in a settler colonial society.
Okay. Yeah, just wanted to pick up on one point that you just raised was, one is the uncomfortability about it. It's like reconciliation isn't going to be easy. We hear that often now, but I think the piece around colonization and its connection to why we're doing land acknowledgements is really critical in kind of understanding the progression of how we got to where we are in terms of land acknowledgement. So it's easy for us to get caught up in the positive pieces without kind of digging deeper about why it's so important. And if we think about colonization's always been about the land and the resources in the land. And so that's part of acknowledging when we're talking about doing land acknowledgements, is understanding the history of the community and its relationship with settler society, and the losses, and understanding some of the losses that Indigenous people in different communities have experienced with the whole process of colonization. And so it's important to remember that. And thank you for raising that, because it just twigged another piece in my mind about colonization. And there's like a number of aspects to colonization, including the piece around how ideology formed a big part of how colonization was able to advance in this country. And of course, the whole ideology and the mindset in terms of advancing colonization was rooted in racism. And the racist ideology that existed about Indigenous people and actually continues to exist. So those are critical elements, I agree.
Okay. Miigwech to you both. This is actually a really good segue for the next question in terms of bringing up the term unceded and the term resources. And I was just noting to you both this morning, driving in, I saw a sign that said UBC's Stewart, no, not with now I can't think of it. The endowment lands, thank you, Daniel. UBC's endowment lands. And I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder how that land in particular is acknowledged when it's being framed as endowment lands. But I wanted to hear both of your thoughts on, so beyond the scope of the actual statement of acknowledgement, have either of your institutions or other institutions that you're aware of, has there been commitments beyond the statement that might be associated with the land acknowledgement? So resources or any sort of material recognition, whether it be for Indigenous students or faculty or curriculum that you have seen being developed that is associated with the land acknowledgement, that gives the land acknowledgement some institutional teeth and clout with Indigenous communities present at these institutions.
In my opening remarks, I talked a little bit about the memorandum of affiliation between UBC and Musqueam, and I think that is a really important foundation for an important point in that relationship. And I think the relationship is ongoing and it's still developing. But I think even in my time, I've been here since 2012, and I've seen so much more reach out and follow up from the university, even in that time. I won't say that it's perfect, but I think there is a lot more engagement with Musqueam, but also with other Indigenous communities, not just in the region, but more broadly. And that gives me a lot of hope. Again, I would never say that it's perfect. And there's still kind of that fundamental reality that we are still in a colonial institution. But I think it is one that has a lot of fracture points and a lot of pressure points, and also a lot of points of increasing interconnection and relationship. And I see a lot more good coming out of that relationship and a lot more hope in terms of sustained funding for students, for staff, for community initiatives, for engagements. The kind of unfortunate irony of UBC, with all of its emphasis on Indigenous partnerships, is there are a lot of people asking for time, attention, and energy from the community and from other communities, to the point that it can be very overwhelming. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, but there's kind of there's the unfortunate part of that enthusiasm is people want to build those relationships, but it's just overwhelming. There's so many, and oftentimes people don't really know how to go about it. So I think that's the flip side that we also have to figure out, is how do we help support our community hosts and partners so that they're not overwhelmed with well-meaning but underprepared researchers who want to engage but are still drawing on people a different resource, which is energy, time. And the community members have to deal with community concerns as well. Their whole focus can't be us at the university. But I think UBC, it's evolving, but I feel more positive about it than I have misgivings.
I think that there's different things that different institutions have been doing to try to increase engagement with Indigenous community as part of acknowledging their relationship and acknowledging that Indigenous peoples exist on those territories that the institutions are located. So a couple of things. They're not always talked about in terms of being directly tied to, quote unquote, the land acknowledgement, but they're certainly tied to pieces around the importance of acknowledging Indigenous people, engaging with them in more meaningful ways and so forth. So one of the things that our institution did, which UBC had in place for many, many years before any institution in Canada, was the First Nations house. Longhouse, right? So more recently, Laurentian University opened an Indigenous Sharing and Learning Center space, and we worked with an Indigenous Advisory Council, which was made up of local Indigenous communities and people in and around the area in terms of the design, where they wanted to have it on campus, what it would look like, who would be housed in the campus, and so forth, and also played a large role in identifying what the purpose would be. And so now that center sits right at the front door door of Laurentian University, because there was talk that maybe it should go up the hill in this kind of wooded area. But our council was really clear that they wanted Indigenous people to be visibly present on the campus, if you will, in a very kind of symbolic way through a building. And so the building sits, like I said, at the front door. It's a 7,500 square foot building. And so when you walk on campus and walk into the front doors of the campus now, you can't miss it. And so I think that that was a huge kind of I want to say symbolic gesture, but it was actually followed up with funds to build it, right? So even though I was kind of the main fundraiser, if you will, along with the development office, the university did commit their own funds to it as well. So half was developed with funds from external dollars that were matched internally from the university. And so that's actually played a big role in shifting what's been happening on our campus. So people are reaching out to us, probably way too much now, because that's the flip side. There isn't enough people in the institution to meet the ongoing demands related to, for lack of a better word, indigenization and decolonization work that's happening across the institution. So that was one thing. The second thing that our university embarked on, and I think we started this around 2010, 2011, we were probably one of the first universities across Canada to do this, but we engaged in targeted Indigenous hires of scholars, and we had made a commitment at that time to hire 5 Indigenous scholars across a variety of disciplines. And probably I would say within 3 to 4 years we had actually hired 10. And so the number now is around 25 Indigenous scholars, and we're a relatively small university in comparison to some of the larger institutions across Canada. We have 8,000 full-time or FTEs on our institution, so having 25 Indigenous scholars is huge. But now when we look also at the percentage of Indigenous students has risen since 2006. I think we had about 400 or 500 Indigenous students. We now have 1,600 Indigenous students on campus, and they represent about 17% of the student body now. So those kinds of things matter. They're really important. So, and they go beyond land acknowledgement with a commitment to do more. And those are some of the big ways. Now, it's not without its challenges. Now we're running into issues around retention of Indigenous scholars, because every institution across Canada has targeted hires now. And so we have a lot of movement of Indigenous scholars moving around from positions. But it also draws attention to the fact that we really need to think through these kinds of initiatives that we're putting on campus and look at what are kind of the long-term commitments that we need to make. So I'll come back to the Indigenous scholar piece. Now it's caused the university to look at what kinds of other commitments do they need to make in terms of retention and keeping people at the university. So those are just a couple of examples.
Just really quickly, when I'm talking about UBC, I've actually been talking about UBC Vancouver, and I think it's also important to point out that there's UBC Okanagan, which also has a really important relationship with the Okanagan Nation. And they're doing very different things in that area with that community and that institution that are part of and in accord with a lot of the things happening here, but because it's a different community and a different history and a different land, the solutions and the processes are quite a bit different, and they are specific to those relationships. So apologies to my Okanagan colleagues. It is important to point out that we have two very different kinds of relationships, but both are partnerships, and those are all connected with our larger strategic plan. And there is an Indigenous strategic plan that's part of the university strategic plan. That has funding and institutional support behind it, and that's connected in very different ways with two very different communities.
Yawa. So you both discussed the demands on folks in terms of developing or maintaining Indigenous initiatives or even crafting a land acknowledgement. So in terms of that work of crafting a land acknowledgement, would you mind sharing some best practices that folks in the room might think about with the work that they're going to do in terms of demands and whether it be community relationship building, of course, to the point that there is no kind of pan-Indigenous way to approach a local community, as you just pointed out, Daniel, but that maybe some general best practices that we can think about.
Yeah, so I think Daniel spoke to the importance of relationships and how kind of critical that piece is to developing a land acknowledgement, because it's really important to go back to the community and talk to people in the community about the land acknowledgement. And I think when we first started the land acknowledgements, it was pre-TRC at our university, and we worked with the Indigenous Advisory Council that we had, and there were representatives from the local Indigenous community on that advisory council. So that was probably a good starting place, and we learned things along the way too. And so now when I reflect back on it, we probably should have did more in terms of reaching out and going right directly to the First Nation community, because what's happened more recently, and I was away when this happened, I was on a sabbatical, but there was another local Indigenous community who wanted also to be recognized. So that really points to one of the lessons learned was about really understanding the history of the communities in and around the territories that the university or the institution occupies, right? And so I met with one of the chiefs of the First Nation community, and he said to me, you have to really understand that traditionally, before settlers moved into this particular area, we moved around this territory, and there was often shared spaces around the boundaries that exist today. And so he used an example that, and the movement was around moving through the waterways. And he said, we moved through the waterways of Sudbury, right out into the Killarney area, into the Georgian Bay, and that cuts across a number of traditional territories of other communities. And so it was kind of a really important a lesson for me to understand that. And I was really happy that I had went back to the local First Nation and talked to them about a land acknowledgement and what was appropriate and how did they want to be acknowledged and what did they want to see come out of it. And so subsequent to that, I went to visit another First Nation community and talked about the same things. And so they often talk about this kind of shared relationship that they had with other Anishinaabeg nations in and around the Sudbury area. And then my own home community, which is the Temiagama Anishinaabe, I know from their land claim that our territory spanned and it butted up right against some of these other communities in the Sudbury area as well. So it's really fascinating when you go back and try to understand the history. And I think that if there was one best practice is to go back and understand the history, but not only from the history books, because they're often kind of distorted anyway, but going back to the people and asking them about what the history is of this land and how they understand it, because there's still elders in the community that can talk to you about that. And before that can even happen, you have to have a relationship with the community. And so some of those things have become really important now. And it's kind of evolved over time as well. And I think it's a good thing. There's a lot to learn about the lands that we sit on when we're working in different institutions.
I think my key idea or my key advice here is not to expect it to be easy. These are complicated histories. They're complicated relationships. They are, all of the issue of, colonialism is about land. well, people have been displaced from lands, and people didn't, sometimes people had shared territories, and sometimes people had conflicts over those shared territories. And sometimes those things also make their way into the conversations around acknowledgements. So I think part of it is to build on that idea of the history, know the history, but understand that you are not necessarily going to get a singular narrative that's easy to work with. You may have to navigate some very complicated contemporary relationships and inter-community politics. You may have to negotiate some complicated identity politics. But that's part of that issue of relationship. I mean, all of these things are a reality that we have to deal with in our daily lives. So why would that not also be part of what we're dealing with here? So I think understanding that these are complicated, but complication does not mean we shouldn't do it. In so many other aspects of our work as scholars, as people who work in knowledge fields, we take up complications eagerly. Why would this be any different? I think we have to do that because honest relationships will be complicated relationships. But we're called to do that. And if we're not willing to do that work, then I think we have to ask ourselves some really serious questions about why we're here.
Thank you. And maybe I'll just add a quick point on that. With the trend of targeted Indigenous hires, I think one of the consequences for to departments of that is that often Indigenous scholars are looked to as like the indigenization rep for the department. And coupled with maybe community responsibilities, student mentorship of Indigenous students who are looking for that sort of special mentoring, which is so crucial, that can become a bit burdensome. And then the flip side to that is, of course, Indigenous scholars and students and staff should be involved in how their community is going to be reflected in the institution. To the point of community and reaching out to community, it shouldn't be thought of as free advice or free consulting. So thinking through how can we actually compensate folks in the community with money or other things, but money is really important for their time, for their expertise. We do that at McMaster with the Indigenous Education Council, where we have a community co-chair. They are paid annually for their work. The co-chair, the academic co-chair, has a course release to help co-chair the council for that year. So thinking through how to use an equity lens to ensure that the Indigenous folks aren't the ones doing all the work, but of course are involved but properly compensated. And that community knowledge is expertise. It's not just those with PhDs. So we have time for one more question. And this one, again, goes to a bit about best practices, but is a bit more specific. And I'm sure you've both gotten questions like this, like when is it appropriate to do a land acknowledgement? Can a non-Indigenous person do a land acknowledgement? Should a local person always be reached out to first? Can we do land acknowledgements in a department meeting, email signatures, those sorts of things? So, of course, we can't answer all of those many questions, but for any of those interventions, do you have anything to say about that? For those who might be a bit reluctant to mispronounce something or to not sure if they should be the one to do it, do you have any advice for the actual saying of the land acknowledgement?
I think sometimes people confuse acknowledgements with welcomes. And I think that's an important distinction. It's not my right to welcome people to Musqueam territory. It is my obligation to acknowledge where I am. And I think we have to keep a distinction between rights and responsibilities. So I think it's presumptuous to assume that you can welcome people to somebody else's territory, just like you wouldn't welcome people to somebody else's house, without the host's permission, right? But you can acknowledge where you are. And that's why I make the distinction between guesthood and visitorhood or visitorship. I because guest means you've been invited and you've been welcomed. Visitor could be benevolent. It could also be one step away from invader, right? But I think we have to make that distinction. I think it's absolutely imperative that people do the acknowledgements. I have been in conferences where every single person on the panel has a lengthy territorial acknowledgement to the point that it starts to feel very rote and very formulaic. But even then, I think, why not? It's good to have it reiterated again and again and again. And if some people find that tiresome, well, they need to listen better. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I do want people to understand why they're making these acknowledgements and not doing it just because they feel like they might be a bad person if they didn't. Because it's not about performing some sort of decolonizing righteousness. It's actually about affirming our responsibilities and relationships. But I think those distinctions are really important for us to keep in mind. Always for a welcome, you need to reach out to your hosts. Acknowledgements, that's an obligation as a visitor to these lands.
I agree with that. That important distinction, because it's weird when we get asked, to do the welcoming and to do the acknowledgement so sometimes we invite Indigenous people from the First Nation community to come in and do the welcome, and then people ask them to do the acknowledgement, and I thought that was kind of bizarre myself, but why would they acknowledge the land that they're on? It's their traditional territory. So that is a really important distinction, but also, I think, like Daniel, that the more that it's done, the better. Even though it does become kind of people are starting to just rhyme it off, I still think it's still important, because then questions can be asked of them about what that means. But if it's never done, there's never an acknowledgement done. There's no conversation. And there's no dialogue about it, right? So now what I've been doing, I had recently a faculty member from one of the departments come in and talk to me about doing a land acknowledgement at their departmental meetings, and how should that happen, or whether it should happen. So I encouraged them to get in contact with the people in the Indigenous Student Affairs office who have local elders that work in the Indigenous Student Affairs, and they're paid as well, so they can assist with coming in and doing some teachings around some of the history and some of the some pieces around community, so that the acknowledgement doesn't just become kind of this rhymed off few sentences that happens. So I've encouraged people to look to people, to bring them in, to talk to them, and to get some of the history. And even when I do the acknowledgements myself, usually I try to think about what have I learned since I got to that particular land. So for example, I was at a conference last year in PEI, and I had an opportunity to visit around PEI before I got to the conference. And I was actually kind of on a journey looking for visible signs of Indigenous people, and where the markers were in the land around it. And there were very few, which is not unusual, especially in Eastern Canada, where colonization happened far before it did here on the West Coast. But nonetheless, when I did the territorial acknowledgement, I also made note of that as well, and somebody tweeted it out. So you can actually have a pretty big impact when you make those kind of statements, especially in public. So I encourage people to do that kind of gathering of information, but also it was good. I had an opportunity to talk to one of the First Nations communities nearby as well about acknowledgement and how they viewed it before I actually did it. So it's that whole piece about building these relationships in the land wherever you go, to understand the people that exist there.
I think also I've found it kind of interesting that the questions I've had about the the value of land acknowledgements have generally been from non-Indigenous people. People who mean well, but who will say things like, well, isn't it now kind of formulaic? What's the value? Really wanting there to be some meat behind that. And I understand that, but my general response is, it's not up to non-Indigenous people to decide whether or not acknowledgements are important. That's up to the Indigenous people on those territories. And if Indigenous people say part of this relationship and this protocol is to acknowledge where you are and who you're in relationship with, then do it. Find out ways to add the significance to that, but it's not up to people who aren't from there to decide whether this is important. That's just another, even with good intentions, that's a colonial move.
Okay, that's excellent. Thanks to you both. We have some time for questions, but before then, I think a round of applause is in order to both of you. So thank you.